From WNPR, this is The Wheelhouse.
The shooter targeted a nightclub where people came together to be with friends, to dance and to sing and to live.
If you don't understand the kind of safety that these places offer us, then you've never tried to hold hands with your partner out in public.
I will no longer stand here absorbing the faux concern, contrived gravity, and tepid smugness of a house complicit in the weekly bloodshed.
Those are some voices from the week's news. I'm John Dankosky. The last few days following the Orlando shooting at a gay nightclub left 49 people dead has us grappling with just about every major issue our country has been trying to figure out in the last year or so, all at once. How to deal with terrorist threats, how America views its Muslim community, how America views its LGBT community, how to deal with the problem of gun violence in America, how to figure out who's dangerous to the public, and how to react when another terrible thing happens. Also, what to make of the things that Donald Trump says. As usual, we'll spend time today talking about the politics behind this week's news. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, wnpr.org/The Wheelhouse. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining me in studio, as always, is Colin McEnroe. He's the host of The Colin McEnroe Show on WNPR. Good morning, Colin.
Good morning, Mr. Dankosky.
Bill Curry is here. He's a columnist for Salon.com. He's a Democratic political analyst. Bill, it's always good to see you.
Hey, John. Thank you.
And also joining us is Leah Wright-Rigueur, who's assistant professor of public policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Her most recent book is The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. Good to see you once again, Leah.
Thanks for having me.
So, Colin, let's just start with you. And I said this to you when we came into the newsroom together. For some reason, this mass shooting, of all the mass shootings we've had, feels a little different to me. And perhaps it's because a few days on, as the news gathers and as we hear more voices chiming in and we hear the reactions in Washington and elsewhere and we find out more news about the shooter, I actually get more sickened. I'm actually feeling worse today than when I first heard about this. I'm not sure how you're feeling about it, but I'm sensing this from a lot of people in America today, that this is something that just feels a little different somehow.
Yeah, I think there's some reasons for that. And one of them is that typically after a shooting like this, after a tragedy like this, one of the things that America does is at least temporarily come together, right? There are these moments where people kind of maybe put away a little bit of their ideology and step forward. I mean, there is inevitably in all of these cases some friction around the issue of guns. If guns are used in the tragedy, there's going to be some friction. And in the age of digital media, the friction starts sooner and sooner each time. But here you have, this incredible mass shooting, and the politics started really before they started removing bodies from the club, right? It was still being treated as a crime scene that they weren't disturbing yet. So all 49 or 50 bodies are sitting there in the club, and you got people kind of thrashing it out in the political sphere. So in some respects, whatever meager amounts of healing that we typically are able to do after something like this, I think we haven't been able to do it this time. And you cannot discount the role of the Republican nominee for president. I mean, he has handled this in a way that's unprecedented, and it's not unprecedented in any good ways either. I mean, it's the way in which he jumped into what Cesar Millan, the dog trainer, calls the red zone, was really kind of shocking and speedy.
And we're going to hear from both President Obama reacting to Donald Trump and also Donald Trump himself in just a moment. But, Bill, your reactions to this and how you feel, if at all, this is a little different than some of the other events that are like this that we've seen in the last couple of years, sadly.
First of all, that something so shocking could, in a sense, be losing its capacity to shock us. It remains incomprehensible. And we now have an almost formulaic response as a nation, a set of rituals that the political classes go through, for one thing, and so you feel just, and you just feel absolutely overwhelmed by how this persists, how this violence persists. Secondly, I just want to say that I think I agree with Colin that I'm shocked at Donald Trump's ability to drag the national conversation over anything down to the absolute lowest depth. That his first response was to question the loyalty and patriotism of the President of the United States in response to this extraordinary, overwhelming human tragedy. Again, just when you think he's lost his capacity to astound, I wish people didn't take the bait of it. I kind of wish that the president and Secretary Clinton had just said we're not gonna respond now. We're going to finish the grieving process, and we're going to come back to this.
Well, as you say, you wish people didn't take the bait. Many people have been saying this on social media. Here is President Obama actually responding to Donald Trump.
We now have proposals from the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States to bar all Muslims from emigrating to America. We hear language that singles out immigrants and suggests entire religious communities are complicit in violence. Where does this stop?
Now, here's Donald Trump's response to what the president had to say.
And I watched President Obama today, and he was more angry at me than he was at the shooter. One of the folks on television said, boy, has Trump gotten under his skin. That's the kind of anger he should have for the shooter and these killers that shouldn't be here.
Leah, your reaction?
So, grief is an apt response. I was horrified when I saw the news. I wanted to grieve, and I felt like my grieving process was cut short. I think Americans, apparently, according to a series of flash polls that have come out, actually agree with this, with about 25%, only about 25% of Americans actually agreeing with Donald Trump's response in saying that it was appropriate, right? So the vast majority believe that it was inappropriate. Only 50% of Republicans, which at this point during a presidential campaign for the Republican Party to be so divided over Donald Trump, agreed with his response to the tragedies. I also think it's important, I know for me, to note how this was an attack on what was largely considered a safe space, right? That it happened at Pulse nightclub, largely LGBTQ nightclub. That it was directly targeted at the gay and lesbian, transgender, queer community. That has some weight, and I don't think that we can disentangle it from a larger conversation that we've been having about LGBTQ rights in this country. And all of that came together under this idea that, and I think the number is still rising, that something like 53 people had been murdered in a space that they considered safe, and that should have been safe for them.
Colin?
Yeah, I think, first of all, one of the struggles we have after things like this is how do you go from the specific to the general, in terms of policy, in terms of politics, in terms of reactions. So we have here down in Florida, I mean, we still don't know the story, and it keeps morphing. We're trying to make up policy narratives about a story that hasn't really reached its angle of repose yet. We don't really quite even understand who Omar Mateen was and who he wasn't. But it does appear as though, in most respects, he was kind of an outlier, that he was somebody who, to use one of the curious phrases of these days, was self-radicalized or was ISIS-inspired rather than ISIS-directed. And maybe we don't even know how ISIS-inspired he might have been. It does seem as though some of his issues were more almost purely psychological. And as I keep saying, he may have something more to do with Mark David Chapman and John Hinckley than he does with, say, the people who coordinated the Paris attacks. He seems a little bit more like that, like a social misfit. So, in so many ways, so much of the rhetoric of the last 3 days seems to be about another story than the one we're actually living through. And I think we have to wait and see how much it changes not only the complexion of politics in America, but the complexion of life. This is one of these moments, I think, like 9/11 and like Sandy Hook, where, in fact, people probably will change some things. I mean, there already was an armed off-duty cop at Pulse nightclub, but you may see more of this kind of stuff in so-called safe spaces that are now understood to be potentially less safe. You may see there may be ways in which just the complexion of life in America does change.
And you have now two communities clearly targeted. As Leah said, the gay community of Orlando and of this nation feels as though this safe space was violated and they were directly attacked. Bill, as we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, though, the Muslim community in America should feel similarly attacked today. Within hours, we deemed this terrorism and Islamic extremism, and only a few days later, many people, including what Colin just said, we seem to be rolling back a lot of what we knew about this man, Omar Mateen, in the first day. Essentially, this may very well be a lone wolf shooter of a type we've never seen before, but clearly not someone who is connected to a coordinated ISIS attack on America. It just feels as though now we have two very large communities of America who were targeted in some way by this, the Muslim community and the LGBT community.
I'm going to risk talking about a tiny silver lining in all of this, and that is that for the whole country to stop and look at the wages of homophobia, for the whole country to stop and look at the insanity of treating people as categories. This is supposed to be America, where you get to be a person, not a category. And to have all of that reinforced. It wasn't just Trump. It was so many Republicans who've, in fact, more than dabbled in homophobic and anti-Islamic politics in the last decade especially, but for longer, who were out actually trying at least to talk in a conciliatory way and in a supportive way about both communities. You know, and this afternoon the president's meeting with the Dalai Lama. I don't know that any president has done that in office. They've sometimes ushered him in the back. Yesterday the Baptist Convention voted to ask its members to stop displaying the Confederate flag. There are these tiny little seedlings of hope in the culture that sometimes just all of this trauma and grief and horror set off. I think people like me sitting and listening to a report on NPR of last night, I heard it, of a man describing how the bars were the only place that gay people in America could go for decades and feel safe and be themselves and have a few hours where they could actually be with their own identity, express their own identity, that this is no way to live, that this is just no way to live, that we have to learn to love one another more deeply and more fully. Surely this message is also resonating in this country, despite all the background noise.
Yeah, and it is maybe background noise, Leah, but I think as Colin says off the top, look, after 9/11 and after many of these other tragedies, Lord knows, as we sat here covering the very close events to us of Sandy Hook, you felt as though America did come together. Now, maybe not over gun policy, certainly, but there was an awful lot we did come together over. But it just seems as though we're blowing apart in a way that I've never quite experienced before. We literally are saying things on social media and even in front of groups of hundreds of thousands of people that you couldn't have possibly imagined politicians saying before. I don't know if this is a new normal. I don't feel particularly comfortable living within this new normal, though. Right,
and I think it's important to remember that this is not normal, that this is not normal political discourse, that, all of a sudden we have the language and the politics and the rhetoric of George Wallace being mainstreamed. And that there needs to be constant reminders that this is not okay. This is not, this is beyond the pale. This is a line in the sand. And so for us, and I think we may talk about this later in the show, but also, for example, over the weekend, the Washington Post has been barred from Donald Trump's his press corps, and that's unheard of, right? Even Richard Nixon, who had this famously kind of hostile relationship with the press, has not done this, and so I think it is important to think about, as we do think about, say, the silver linings, about how people have come together kind of under the banner of anti-homophobic campaigns, anti-Islamophobia, things like that, how discourse in this country has changed and how not normal that is.
Well, I just want to actually turn to something that we've heard in the last couple of days that was truly not normal. At the very top of the program, we heard Connecticut's 4th District Congressman Jim Himes. He gave a speech on the floor of the House where he walked out during the moment of silence. He spoke about this to NPR's All Things Considered last night.
First of all, I wasn't trying to lead a crusade here. I didn't organize an effort, and I was very careful about it because the moment of silence in that context to me remains more of an affront to the victims of Orlando than honoring them. But look, if it is a sign of respect and if it makes other people feel better, God bless, go ahead and do it. However, what I do think we can do is we can start talking about this, particularly as Democrats. We tend to use very technocratic policy language. We got to start talking about this differently. I mean, let's use religious terminology. Let's ask the question, which we never asked, by the way, if Jesus Christ appeared in front of us tomorrow, and the man who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," the man who said, "Turn the other cheek," you think he'd sign on for the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun? I want to know. I want to hear my evangelical friends answer that question.
Look, Colin, I mean, I think a lot of people might be critical of Jim Himes for taking this particular stand during a moment of silence. But as Leah said, I mean, there's a lot that may be coming out of this that is different in our political discourse. This certainly felt like a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, this one's been brewing for a while, and that the notion of the vacuity of thoughts and prayers, that started on Twitter, I think, during Charleston, maybe. Although there's actually sort of a shock comedian whose national tour was called that. I think he's maybe the first person that I heard actually sort of say, "Well, thoughts and prayers don't really mean anything compared to what's actually necessary here." So, I mean, Himes didn't start this. It really did start a cycle or two ago in our dialogue about mass shooting. And I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to evaluate this. I don't really know that it furthers the debate that much. I think it's a little bit more an expression of frustration, that particularly Connecticut congresspersons who have been trying to push for gun control reforms in the wake of Sandy Hook, they say repeatedly, look, if the death of those 20 children and 6 others, if that wasn't enough to move the pile, then what's ever going to move the pile? I think you're sort of seeing that brimming over here. I'm not sure that it's necessarily an effective form of political theater.
Bill?
I also, this may seem a bridge too far in the current context, but I also await the moment at which this discussion broadens out a little bit on our side. And there is, as I said, something formulaic. There's a tragedy, and we all grieve it, and Democrats insist on gun control. Something the right talks a lot about is the overriding culture, and they don't do it in ways that appeal to me. But I look at in the United States, certainly. I was listening to Colin's great show with David Edelstein yesterday about the summer blockbusters and this constant propagation of an ethos of violence, this constant propagation of the idea that the heroes are the people who take the law into their own hands, the constant apocalyptic tone of popular entertainment, the fantasy world that we are awash in today in popular culture, I think needs examination. We have to ask ourselves why it is that this particular species of radical Islam, like the species of violence among the Dylan Roofs of this world, have risen up, have grown so much in the last 30 years. There are economic answers to this. Some of the things that we're learning now about this shooter remind us of the psychosexual origins of violence itself and of the cultural archetypes that we're dealing with. We have to take a long look at ourselves, at a deep look at our own society and at the global culture and the global economy, which is producing so much such extraordinary, extreme, futile, and violent behavior.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about what we're learning about and what we're talking about around gun policy in America and LGBT rights. We're going to be talking with you as well. You can join us 860-275-7266. This is The Wheelhouse on WNPR. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. Today on the program, we're looking back at the week's news, which is, of course, dominated by the Orlando shootings. If you want to join us, 860-275-7266. Comment on our website, WNPR.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Joining me in studio is Leah Wright-Rigueur from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, Bill Curry, our Democratic political analyst, and also, of course, Colin McEnroe from the Colin McEnroe Show. Colin, what's on your show today?
My friend David Jacobson always imagines a day in the future where he'll be sitting in a restaurant and the waiter will say, okay, we're bringing you the last fish. This is like the last fish on the planet, so really enjoy it. So fish are actually really, really interesting. They're much more interesting than people suppose, and they have looks more complex mental and social lives than you might imagine. We wonder whether that would make a difference to people. Even people who call themselves vegetarians are pretty happy eating fish, which may be one reason we're just about hunting them to extinction.
So fish today on the Colin McEnroe Show, 1 o'clock. Fascinating program. Hope you can join us for that. Let's go first to Barbara, who's in Riverside. Hi, Barbara.
Hi there.
Hi, what's up?
Well, I just wanted to respond to characterizing President Obama's statement as politically motivated, that it was too soon for that. I don't think it was a political statement at all. I believe it was a statement about our national security and a message to the country and the world that although we have a presumptive candidate for president of the United States, that he is not expressing America's statements about the Muslim faith or immigrants at all. I really don't think it was a campaign statement. I believe it was in the interest of national and global security, and I strongly support that position.
Yeah, and Barbara, I don't think that we were saying that. Are you talking about what we said about the president coming out and calling this terrorism on Sunday, or?
No, about when I think it was in conjunction. I know that Hillary Clinton also made a statement, and of course she is running for president, so
sure.
You can see that as a political statement. But when the president called out Donald Trump's, without naming him, his statements about banning Muslims from the country, I think it was very, very important for the President of the United States to make it clear to the country and the world that we do not feel that way about Muslims.
Sure. No, thank you very much for that. Yeah, and I'll just to be clear, I don't think that we said that there was a political statement, but I do appreciate your phone call. We were playing that tape in conjunction with Donald Trump as he was responding to something Trump had said. Quickly, Bill.
The caller was probably referring to something that I said. And I didn't mean to suggest a false equivalency between what the Secretary said, what the President said, and what Trump did. I hope I made it clear that it was very much Trump dragging down the whole national discourse. And I think that everything the President said was entirely appropriate. I'd stand by the observation that I would have been happier if they'd waited a day to engage Trump and continue to participate in the process of grief, and even perhaps have identified that that's exactly what they were doing, and that they would come back to it later. But it's a political observation. It's not meant to criticize the substance of anything.
Could I just say one thing about that?
Sure.
I do think there is something very significant about all this that has started right now, and it's going to continue, which is that maybe more than at any time in at least my political memory, our other two panelists may remember differently. I think you're going to see two people running against Trump. I think you're going to see the Democratic nominee and the sitting president. I mean, he's really mad right now, and this is a guy who questioned his birth status way back when, and he doesn't like anything he's hearing right now. And, it's not as though sitting presidents are always silent in the races that follow their second terms, but I think you're going to see an unusually aggressive president right now running as hard against Donald Trump almost as Hillary Clinton is. He is ready to go, and they kind of set him free. Trump kind of set him loose with this set of remarks.
Lee, and I'd wanted to talk to you about that too. That this notion that President Obama, when he is angry, he doesn't necessarily sound angry like the rest of us sound angry. Like if I'm angry, you know it, right? I'm waving my hands around in the air. Even in his most angry tone, which is what we heard just before in response to Donald Trump, he did not seem like a terribly angry person. I guess my question to you as a political analyst is would more anger about what's happening in the world, about how he feels about gun control, about Donald Trump, would it help the President Hillary Clinton right now, or is feeding into the anger that we all feel something that maybe this president needs to back off of a little bit?
So I think the interesting thing about Obama, and by this point now, 8 or 9 years in, we all know when Obama is angry, when he is really angry versus when he's a little bit angry, when he's not angry at all. And he's really mastered a technique of being able to show anger without becoming an angry black man, right? That there's no two ways of dancing around it. He is a black president, right? He's a president who happens to be black, however you want to phrase it. And so I think he's learned to kind of walk this very fine line. But as Colin said, right, this is the same. We're talking about a person, him running against, or Hillary Clinton running against a person who led the birther movement in 2011, who really launched his political career, right, his national political career, by calling for copies of Barack Obama's birth certificate. So the president is angry. But I do think that we've seen a lot, especially on the left, of calls for, I think, more targeted policy making around, right, that's centered on that anger. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see much more strategic displays of anger that are centered on kind of actually doing something, actions, right? Less thoughts and prayers and much more about strategy and policy and programs.
Yeah, and I'll say when it comes to the issue of gun control, Jim Himes, as we talked about earlier, Colin, maybe ramps it up a little bit more and says, I'm done talking about this. I'm done with the thoughts and prayers. The president, even in his speech the other day, ask the question again, when are we going to? Now, your former colleague at the Hartford Courant, Helen Ubinas, who now writes for the Daily News in Philadelphia, in her latest column, she actually did something slightly different. She timed how long it took her to purchase an AR-15 in the wake of the Orlando shooting. It took 7 minutes from the time she handed the salesperson her driver's license to passing a background check. I guess I'd love your reaction to Helen's piece, but also just to this notion that more and more people in America who are pushing for gun control measures seemingly are finding new ways to have this conversation other than throwing up their hands and going, when will Congress do something about it?
First of all, I thought Helen's piece was great, and having worked with Helen and having had there be days when she was mad at me, it did make me feel good to know she could get that kind of weapon that easily. But, here's what I think. First of all, I think one of the things that we've learned here in Connecticut is that gun control measures can be effective. They have a downside to them, which is that people stockpile in advance of them. The trend that we've seen in this country over the long haul is reduced per capita gun ownership, and at least I probably put that the wrong way, but reduced gun ownership. There are fewer people who own guns. The people who own guns own more of the guns. And you're probably going to see that trend continue, which is a great argument for background checks, because now there are fewer people who want to own guns, and so the question would be, well, who are you, and why is it you want to own this gun, and why do you need it in the next 7 minutes? I think as a political issue in this campaign, it's still going to be a tough one, and I think you're going to look for the wedgiest version of it, and it appears as though the wedgiest version of it, the one that tracks the best in polling, is that whole no-fly issue, right? You can be on the no-fly issue, you can still on the no-fly list, you can still own a gun. That's probably the issue you'll hear the most, because it polls a lot better than more generalized questions about limiting access to certain kinds of weapons.
It does, but I just worry, Bill, about that. And maybe this is the issue that tracks the best, and maybe this is the issue that the Democrats go after. But there is this nagging question about who makes the list, who gets to be put on the list. And if I'm part of a very large Muslim community in America, I start to wonder, hold it, what's going on here? Are we going to start making lists of people with certain types of names? Are we going to make lists of certain types of people who go on certain websites? And all of a sudden, there's a new list that I might end up on?
I'm amazed at the willingness of so much of the American of America today to give up its right to privacy. People will give away everything that you could know about them for a Groupon discount to some private corporation, and these ought to be great concerns. The trade-off here is pretty simple. If you're on the no-fly list, you shouldn't be able to get a gun. Let me just say one thing though about one further point about it, and that is that I'm reminded of this whole discussion of bipartisanship. And when people call for bipartisanship, usually what I think they really mean is not that they care whether the votes came equally from two parties or from both parties in some measure, but that people were civil and reasoned and nonpartisan in their approach. We're never going to get a meaningful compromise if the best you can get is to get the no-fly people on background checks. A Republican Congress, I don't want to make this partisan today, but a Republican Congress is never going to pass any form of meaningful gun safety legislation. End of story. The only way that change comes is with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House and a committed, and at that, a very committed Democratic president.
But one of the things that Jim Himes was saying is that his own colleagues aren't taking this up enough, that the Democratic Party itself is complicit sitting back and doing the prayer and sitting back and saying nothing.
I couldn't agree more. But again, I don't want to engage in a false equivalency here. When we had a Democratic Congress, we were able to pass an assault weapons ban. And when you don't have a Democratic Congress, you can't. I know we all hate to hear any questions distilled into partisan terms, but there are a handful of differences that are really that simple. There's a terrible bipartisan consensus on pay-to-play politics and trade and foreign interventionism, but then there are real differences between the parties, and this wedge issue has become one of them. The Democrats are weak. The Republicans are totally intransigent.
Is this the thing, Leah, that Democrats and Republicans maybe come together on a no-fly list, or is there a battle over assault weapons? Is there a battle over some of the issues that have happened, here in Connecticut that have made their way into law?
Nope. There's absolutely a battle. I mean, Colin mentioned this earlier in the show, but if after Newtown, we couldn't pass legislation, if we couldn't pass bipartisan legislation, if there couldn't be a commitment, even as public opinion, even as gun owners, right? The vast majority of gun owners support common sense kind of legislation and restrictions on guns and regulation, right? If we can't do it then, when can we do it? So I think that we are going to have to think differently about this. Maybe think about it in different language. Maybe, approach it in very different ways. What those ways are, I'm not really sure, in part because there's, funding for studying gun violence has been cut.
Well, and Himes brings this up, and I think this is, of all the things that maybe people can get behind and understand, the notion that we can't study as a public health issue deaths by guns seems something that is a remedy that most Americans would easily agree to. How is it possible that we can study toxins in our water, and we can study the cereal that our kids eat in the morning, and we can study whether or not the seatbelt is going to save us in a crash, but we can't study whether or not this particular gun is used in more deaths than this particular gun?
Right. And so I think there are some ways around it. And I know that Yale has been doing some interesting work. And I wonder if part of it is, too, publicizing some of that work that suggests, that the problem really is handguns, that the problem is handguns for young white men, death by suicide, things like that, deaths in the household. I also wonder, too, and I think this comes back to Bill's point about maybe at least trying to change a little bit of the conversation to something about culture of violence. And what does it mean to have such a violent culture, right? It's interesting to me that the time that you really get conservative politicians on board in talking about violence is when you start talking about crime in urban areas. Now, we all kind of know that this is kind of a red herring or a thing that you throw out, but is there a way to maybe use this conversation or entryway to really talk about what does violence look like? How can we study violence? And there are some interesting things going on in that respect, in that regard.
And I think a lot of governors around states who have passed more stringent gun laws, including Governor Malloy, have said this time and time again, Colin, the guns that end up as illegal guns in the city of Chicago were bought legally at some point. The fact is that because different states have different rules, because Helen Ubinis is able to go into a Philadelphia store and purchase an AR-15 in 7 minutes, and maybe it takes a lot longer, it's much more complicated in Connecticut, actually that's a problem if we want to track and trace both legal gun sales and also illegal gun sales, the very types that are killing dozens and dozens and dozens of people on the streets of cities like Chicago.
So that's a conversation we have about a lot of different topics, right? The degree to which we don't universalize things in the United States makes it very, very difficult to have effective federal policy. And, I mean, we talk about this when we're talking about economic policies of the states. I've compared it to a whole line of gas stations with different prices, and people move their companies around not based on the interest of anything except the best deal they could get in a particular state. So, yeah, the fact that the state's laws are very patchwork and idiosyncratic makes it really hard to create effective policy unless you can really do it at the federal level. To do that, you have to shift one thing, and this is why maybe the no-fly argument, and I take your point about how arbitrary the no-fly list is. We know Ted Kennedy was on it at one point, but maybe the no-fly list is important in this way. You have to pierce the argument, that basic Second Amendment argument. There are a lot of people out there who will say, look, the government has no right to abridge my access to the firearms that I want. And the reality is, look, you can't take your gun on a plane right now. You can't do that. I mean, we do make reasonable laws and rules. It's really not true that you can have your gun wherever you want or that you can have any kind of weapon you want. There are kinds of weapons that are illegal. So in some ways, we have to start that conversation, and maybe the no-fly list is a place to start it.
Bill?
We have throughout the world, in the United States and throughout the world, a generation of young men who increasingly feel alienated, who aren't even aspiring to go to college, who are dropping out, who are trying to find a way and not finding one in the society. And the dominant culture globally, and especially here in the United States, is one of violence. The most constant instruction they receive is in a fantasy world of violence. And to have that match of a global economy which has an entire generation feeling imprisoned and a popular culture which is constantly propagating fantastical images of people solving their problems through violence, I think it's a toxic combination. And so if we're going to look at radical Islam, we're going to look at these other symptomatic pockets throughout the world, we have to look at the larger picture and what we ourselves are creating.
I want to move on to just the other piece of this that we've not jumped over completely, but I wanted to get to because the impact of this community on the LGBT community of this event is something that we shouldn't overlook, certainly. This feels like it's a big step back, a reminder of the threats that people in the LGBT community still face, especially in a state like Florida, where state government fought against same-sex marriage. This all came to light during an interview that CNN's Anderson Cooper did with Attorney General of Florida, Pam Bondi. Let's listen.
Do you worry about using language accusing gay people of trying to do harm to the people of Florida when doesn't that send a message to some people who might have bad ideas in mind?
Anderson, I don't believe gay people could do harm to the state of Florida.
But you argued that in court.
My lawyer argued a case defending what the Supreme Court allowed the voters to put in our state constitution.
But you were arguing that gay marriage, if there was gay marriage, if there was same-sex marriage, that would do harm to the people of Florida, to Florida society.
That it was constitutional to put that in the Constitution.
Are you saying you did not believe it would do harm to Florida?
Of course not. Of course not. Gay people. No, I've never said that. Those words have never come out of my mouth.
But that is specifically what you were arguing in court.
No. What we argued was it was in the Constitution of the state of Florida.
Okay, again, that's Anderson Cooper from CNN talking with the Attorney General of the state of Florida, Pam Bondi. Just your reaction, Leah, because, again, this does bring us back to one of the other things I think America's been grappling with as much as Islamic extremism, terrorism threats, how we deal with our Muslim community, and certainly how we deal with violence in the African-American community. One of the things we've really been struggling with in America over the course of the last couple of years is rights for the LGBT community, and this brings it, again, right into focus.
Right, and so for the past, past several years, past several months, past several weeks, we've been having conversations that explicitly discuss LGBTQ rights in language that is inherently violent, right? So even just think about the transgender bathroom debate, right, which in North Carolina, a lot of it has come down to, well, there might be men in the bathroom with our little girls, and we need to protect them, right? And a lot of it has been done in the language of we need to protect them against violence, right? So the way that we talk about these rights, about these communities, about these people, has really been couched in this kind of language of violence. Pat Robertson came out after the shooting and said, you reap what you sow, essentially. And so there is, even as politicians have come out and said, no, they have to at least understand the role that they have played in creating a culture or a language that says, or that implies that violence towards these people is okay or is an acceptable way of dealing with it, even if it's language, even if it's actual physical acts.
Yeah, I don't think it wasn't lost on me, and certainly not on a lot of people, Colin, that the rescue that happened when Omar Mateen was killed by police happened because police went in and had to punch a hole in a bathroom to get him out. He'd killed a bunch of people, and he was going to kill a whole bunch more. This is a man dressed like a man with a couple of guns, and that seemed like the biggest threat in America and maybe the world at that particular moment.
Yeah, and just to sort of go back to the Cooper-Bondi exchange and to kind of contextualize that a little bit. So that had to do with the 2014 case in which Florida was challenging the notion that they would have to recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. In 2008, they put an amendment, as you said, to their own constitution saying that. So there were sort of two parts to that argument. One of them was, well, it might do harm to us if we had to do things that aren't in our constitution. But in fact, Bondi, who seemed very inarticulate and unable to lay out Florida's case at all in that particular interview, Bondi and her staff argued in the document, I'm going to quote from the document, Florida's marriage laws then have a close, direct, and rational relationship to society's legitimate interest in increasing the likelihood that children will be born to and raised by the mothers and fathers who produce them in stable and enduring family units. That's just quoted from the documents filed in that case. So, I mean, I think Cooper's right in saying, you can't pretend you have an enlightened view of this now because the chickens have come home to roost. You didn't as recently as 2 years ago. You had the most retrograde possible argument about this. So who are we kidding?
Well, and a big argument then, Bill, is if you are talking about one of the culprits in America being our culture of violence and our culture of intolerance, then the way that we speak about the other actually is incredibly important. right? The way that we speak about
question.
our Muslim brothers and the way that we speak about our black brothers and the way we speak about the LGBT community is really important when it comes to this.
I want to make two observations. One slightly off point to your question, which is that what Anderson Cooper did, and even Jake Tapper, I've spent the last year criticizing the mainstream media, and both those guys in the last few weeks have been asking harder questions. Different things have driven them to do a little more of the vetting process that the media seems content to leave to the judiciary, and so that's a positive sign. And the second thing, though, is to the point you raised. It's more permissible to speak angrily than it is to speak in a loving way in our political culture. It is actually easier. That one is less afraid of being embarrassed, and I would just thinking about this as we all have continuously over the last few days. I am, despite everything that happened, I am so deeply impressed. The most successful political movement of my recent life has been the gay marriage movement. And it has been a movement led at the total grassroots level by people who bravely shared the truth of their lives with their family and friends, who walked into their communities, who provided the kind. It is a model of political leadership based on love, truth, and self-revelation. It is in those three ways exactly the formula that Gandhi said that all social change occurred by: love, truth, and self-revelation. And I continue to be inspired by that example. All other political movements should look to that movement. And even in the cinders of Orlando, I do see evidence that it will be a little harder to hate. It'll be a little harder to hate. And in that sense, there is something that all these senseless deaths have achieved.
We're going to take a break right now. When we come back, we want to talk a little bit about a piece that was written by one of our guests, Leah Wright-Rigueur from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, about how we remember some of the great figures of our past. She wrote a piece about Muhammad Ali and Ronald Reagan. There's a lot more to talk about around this week's news as well, with Bill Curry and with Colin McEnroe. This is Where We Live and the Wheelhouse. This is The Wheelhouse. I'm John Dankosky. We're joined by Colin McEnroe from WNPR, Bill Curry, our Democratic political analyst, and Leah Wright-Rigueur from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. A couple quick things before we end up the show, Colin. One has to do as we head into the general election, we'll probably learn even more about the candidates. Russia may actually know more than we do at this point. Russia has broken into the Democratic National Committee. Yeah,
this is the very embodiment of a developing story. I mean, I don't think we really quite understand what has happened here, but to the extent that we do, it appears as though two different groups of Russian hackers, I'm sure working in some kind of coordination, broke into the DNC records and got all kinds of things, including some of, or if not all of, the DNC's opposition research about Donald Trump, although how that could be top secret when Donald Trump basically runs on opposition research about him and wallows in it and celebrates it, I don't know. I'm going to do something that Donald Trump would do, the sort of Roy Cohn kind of smear that he specializes in so much. But I can't help but notice that Paul Manafort, who's now become sort of part of a big part of the Donald Trump brain trust, has all these ties to the Ukraine, particularly with their former their pro-Russian former president. Yeah. I mean, not only do Trump and Putin have this kind of, ill-defined bromance, but, I mean, Manafort behind the scenes does have some pretty heavy connections to some big players in that part of the world. So, and really, I shouldn't. It is a Roy Cohn thing to do to bring it up. The's no real reason.
But what you're saying, really, though, is that people are saying it.
Right. That's right.
And
people are saying it.
You're not saying it.
I know.
People are.
Isn't it possible that you saw this on the internet?
That's right.
Did you read this?
People are saying this.
What can I do? This is where it starts.
Let me just say,
that's what I would agree with.
There's more to this story. There's something he's not telling us.
Yeah.
Okay, Bill, let's just quickly turn to something substantive. Last night, after the D.C. primary, the final primary, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders finally sit down for about 90 minutes. They talk. Bernie's going to talk to his supporters on Thursday. Do we have now, especially in the light of everything else that's happening in the world, do we have this week Bernie Sanders saying, I support Hillary Clinton, you should too?
Yeah, I think we will. Or we'll have something very certain. First of all, we've already had, I intend to support her, There's this little bit of a question here about how he goes through the convention, what he does in the platform. There's really not much to negotiate here. I'll just say very quickly that number one, he wants party rules changes that I doubt the Democrats will give him. The caucuses are in more trouble than superdelegates with this Democratic establishment. Two, what's in the platform doesn't mean nearly as much as whether the candidate means it. And that's something you can't negotiate. I was on the platform committee 2004. I helped write the 2000 platform. In 2008, I went around the Denver convention and tried to find a delegate who had read the platform. I couldn't. We should insist that the platforms mean more than they do. We should fight for them to mean more. But there's a limit to their meaning, and especially given the degree to which our politics is about using phrases to create the appearance of reconciliation where the policies have not been reconciled. There's a limit to what it means. Lastly, there's nothing they have that Bernie really wants. This isn't going to be a marriage. It's going to be a truce. And you saw it in the Times story this morning. What we're going to have here is a coalition of two groups that in any other country would be in separate parties. And they will unite to try to defeat the fascist Trump.
I want to end, Lee, on a story that you wrote this past week. Last week on the Wheelhouse, we didn't get a chance to talk about the death of one of the most monumental figures in U.S. history for a lot of reasons, boxer Muhammad Ali. You brought up a story that a lot of us had kind of forgotten, if we knew about it at all, that he'd thrown his support behind Ronald Reagan for president.
Yes, he threw his support behind Ronald Reagan. So did Joe Frazier. So did Floyd Patterson. There's some rumors that Ken Norton may have done it. And then later he said he came to regret that. He said it was bad advice. But then also supported at different points in time Orrin Hatch, who spoke at his funeral on Friday, or at the service on Friday, also supported George H.W. Bush. And his friends were perplexed by this. His family members were perplexed. But I think it tells us a lot about many different things. And, I'm happy to share the article with the audience. But one of the things that struck me, especially in light of the Orlando incident, is that the way that the Republican Party talks about Muslims has changed dramatically over the course of 30 some odd years, where even Muslims, for the most part, through 2000, overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party. And since 2000, it has dropped to the point where there is virtually no support for the Republican Party. So here you have, in 2000, as late as 2000, we have Republican candidates saying, Muslims are our friend and we need to be careful. George W. Bush saying we need to be careful about how we treat this issue. And now here we have the candidate for president of the United States saying, hey, maybe we need to think about a Muslim database. And so there's been this radical transformation, and we really see that come to play in something like the death of Muhammad Ali and this kind of weird relationship with Ronald Reagan.
Colin?
Well, yeah. First of all, just on the subject of athletes and their politics, I'm reminded that Charles Barkley was talking at one point about running for governor of Alabama as a Republican, and his grandmother said, but Charles, Republicans only care about the rich. And he said, Grandma, I am the rich. But, I think Leah's point is a really interesting one. There was a piece 2 days ago about how Mormons are not going to support Donald Trump. So if you lost Muslims and Mormons in the space of 15 years, you really are miscalculating here. These were formerly dependable constituencies, and you're finding ways to alienate them.
We have just about a minute and a half left. Bill, very quickly.
Ali, like lots of athletes, wasn't great at analyzing public policy or sorting out all the various partisan factions. But whenever he took a stand himself on an issue, it was the right thing.
I have to read a tweet, and I think this tweet more than anything else proves that Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, listens to our humble program, The Wheelhouse. He's just tweeted out this hour, I will be meeting with the NRA, who has endorsed me, about not allowing people on the terrorist watch list or the no-fly list to buy guns. That's the first time, Lee, I've heard that out of Donald Trump's mouth, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like he's supporting Obama's position.
It does sort of sound like he's supporting Obama's position.
This entire fall will be a series of issues in which Trump is either at or to the left of the Democratic nominee, from issues from trade to foreign interventionism to health care, et cetera. It's sit back and get ready for a long ride.
I said it was the wedgiest issue. He probably wants it off the table. When he tweets, Bill Curry's a big jerk, then I'll believe he listens to the Wheelhouse.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump...
Then we'll know you've hijacked his account.
If you are listening, Donald Trump, please do tweet at WNPR Wheelhouse. Thanks to Colin McEnroe, host of The Colin McEnroe Show. Thanks to Bill Curry, and thanks to Leah Wright-Rigueur. Thanks to you for listening. This is The Wheelhouse here on WNPR.